Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in today. My name's Caitlin, and I am on unceded Jara country, and pay my respects to the Dja Dja Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, who are the rightful custodians of this land. I am so excited to be here with Erin and Julia tonight. So to start off with, I thought maybe we could each introduce ourselves and maybe speak a bit to our relationship to tonight's topic. But I also just wanted to acknowledge that, particularly maybe in the context of the topic that we're talking about tonight, we met each other. Well, I'm not sure if you two know each other, but I met the both of you 3 minutes ago. And so I also wanted to say, like, how you going? How are you feeling at this kind of midpoint of a very busy festival? Julia, would you like to kick off?
Sure. I'm feeling pretty good overall. Erin and I pre-recorded an event together a couple of weeks ago, I think it was. So we met and had a chat then. That was, really beautiful. But I've been speaking so much about disability and activism and writing with people over the course of this festival, and it's just been so heartwarming and so nourishing, and I've had a really really awesome time so far, and I don't doubt that I will continue having a great time. Should I introduce myself at the same time?
Yeah, I reckon. Let's do that.
So my name is Julia. I am broadcasting, and I live and work on Wurundjeri land in Naarm. I am a writer, first and foremost, a support worker, facilitator, and an organiser. I'm Māori and Polish, and otherwise a settler here on this land. And I would like to pay my respects as well to the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people, who are the traditional owners of not only the land that I live on, but also the land that I frequently travel around on, as well as the Noongar people in Bulu, so-called Perth, which is the land that I grew up on and that formed a lot of my beliefs and opinions about these kinds of topics.
Thanks, Julia. Erin?
Hey everyone, I'm Erin. I'm on Ngunnawal country and would like also to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I'm doing okay. Like I've had a really chill Saturday, so just took a walk. I'm in lockdown at the moment, but it's been okay. I've actually it's like sort of the second lockdown for Canberra, and I'm just in a lot more like a stable position. Like I'm in more stable housing, and like everything, like there's enough space for all of us and that kind of thing. So things have been pretty chill. And I'm really enjoying the festival. I haven't gone on to that many events yet, but I'm planning on catching up with things as well. I guess my relationship to the topic is that I'm disabled, I have chronic illness, and these are topics that I really think a lot about and write about. And yeah, I have lots of thoughts. So yeah, thanks.
I'm very excited to hear as many of those thoughts as we possibly can in the time that we have. That leaves me. I'm Caitlin, and I'm also a writer, an editor, arts worker, and a library worker as well. My relationship to this topic is, I think, quite complicated. My initial response to getting the invite for this event was that I didn't feel like I was enough of an activist. I'm not an organizer. And I think I don't bring this up to self-disparage, but because I think that there was maybe some internalized stuff going on there about what activism should look like, and what kind of activism counts, which is maybe something we can talk a bit more about. So I think that kind of leads into my first question, because I think that often when we talk about disability and politics, we talk about access to political movements, and there's an assumption there that those political movements are perhaps being run by abled people. And while I think that's a really important discussion, I also want to acknowledge from the very beginning of this discussion that disabled and chronically ill people have our own histories of activism that hold their own types of knowledge and political expertise. So I wanted to start off by asking each of you, what are some ways that you think disability or experiences with chronic illness can be a strength when it comes to activism? If at all.
I guess for me, like going back to what you were saying, Caitlin, about what activism looks like, I think one of the strengths is being a bit more flexible with that approach. Activism can look like care, I think, or it can look like being yourself and like asking for what you need. And it can look like rest. I think, especially like in a capitalist society, like just taking some time to rest can be activism, because it's like we've got all these messages telling you not to rest. And I think, being like, more flexible in that approach to me has been a real strength.
And facilitating then, the rest and the care of other people as well. Like if you're looking after yourself, you can look after your communities, which reminds me actually, Julia, of your article in Overland in 2019, which was like a very big one for me reading it, which looks at that kind of, like you look at Audre Lorde and you talk about that idea of self-preservation as political warfare. So I imagine you also have thoughts on this. Do you have any kind of thing to add?
I do. There are like a lot of thoughts kind of come to mind, but I spoke about quite a few of them in a panel that I was part of yesterday on, I can't remember the title of it. Maybe Mike can pop it in the chats for me. But we spoke a lot about how activism can take lots of different forms, and it can look really differently to different people, especially depending on what people are capable of doing. It was called 3 parts listening, 1 part chanting. Thanks, Mike. How it can look really different depending on where someone is coming from, the context that they're working in. Obviously, not everyone has access to or the ability to be a part of big demonstrations, which is what we typically think about when we think about activism. And not only because they might be disabled or chronically ill or criminalized or have these kinds of identities that make it much unsafer or perhaps impossible to be a part of, but also there are people who live in rural or remote areas where that kind of organizing work just isn't it just isn't as easy to organize or as perhaps as applicable in those contexts, compared to places like, say, Melbourne, where we have protests that amass like hundreds of thousands of people. And so, I think something that really changed the way that I think about activism and think about organizing is, this idea of care and mutual aid and love and rest and things like that being actually really radical in so many different contexts. And I think it's really important to note that, Erin, as you said, we exist in a capitalistic world, and we exist in a world where we and others are experiencing the impacts of settler colonialism and imperialism and white supremacy. And so many of those systems are trying to divide us and trying to make us be wholly independent people, and trying to make it, every man for himself or whatever, and a dog-eat-dog world and all of this stuff that really pits us against each other. So when we actually come together and when we build relationships with each other that are sustainable and that have a shared vision and are joyful and prioritize rest and aren't hard and aren't aren't like bogged down in the everyday things that we always have to be focusing on doing, like working and getting money and making sure that we have enough food on the table and things like this. I think that those things are also, really radical acts, and like being able to build to a world of interdependence, I think is really special. And so many people are doing that work every day, and we don't necessarily recognize it as activism, but so often it is.
Yeah, totally agree. And I know I was watching your panel yesterday, Julia, and I know that you had already had that discussion. I would encourage anyone watching to go back and watch that panel, and I don't want to ask you to repeat yourself too much. But I know that in that panel there was a discussion around sustainability and the difficulty of finding ways to sustain activism movements. And for me, I think that that's definitely something that sick and disabled communities can bring to political movements, because burnout is such a huge problem in political movements, and who better to turn to for solutions to those problems, even if they're not kind of hard and fast solutions. But there's so much knowledge and so much experience of community care and resilience in disabled and sick communities that I think is hugely applicable to just general political movements. Erin, did you have any thoughts about like the kind of around that idea of sustainability of activism? Because I think it's a big question for disabled people, in that it can be very draining in a lot of ways, depending on how we engage.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's particularly draining when you, especially when you're an individual, like trying to get access arrangements or that kind of thing. And it's almost like arguing that you deserve to exist. And I think just on the face of it, that's just such an exhausting posture to have to take. I guess like one of the things I've been thinking about in terms of the pandemic is that this, like the disabled and chronically ill community does have a lot of expertise in particular, like around the pandemic. So like things like many of us like have actually lived under conditions that are a lot like lockdown for, quite extended periods of time. We understand vulnerability, and we understand that like any like if you're not disabled, you're probably pre-disabled. Like everyone's vulnerable, and like thinking about policy and that kind of thing from that angle, is going to be more like helpful in the long run and sustainable, I think. And yeah, and I think from that, like one of the things that makes it sustainable is that expertise, is like learning from experience, like individual experience, and being able to translate that into like a wider lessons for that are really valuable for everyone.
Do you feel like in the context of the pandemic, do you feel like disabled and chronically ill communities have been listened to? Because there's definitely a wealth of expertise there. What are both of your experiences in terms of like, do you feel like there is a potential shift of a mainstream recognition of that expertise, or are you maybe, please excuse my dog, maybe less optimistic than that?
Does
that make sense as a question?
Yeah, I feel like it hasn't, it's almost like a Cassandra type situation where it's like you can see clearly what's going to happen and no one's believing you, kind of thing. I think the CFS/ME community has been really vocal about the dangers of things like long COVID, and I don't think those lessons have been like really adequately like understood by the wider public. And I think also one of the things that we've been talking about is how inappropriate it is to talk about people dying of COVID with, pre-existing conditions, when something like 40% of Australians have a pre-existing condition in the sense that it would make COVID worse. So like I feel like a lot of these messages are really like been quite vocal about them, and Yeah, but I don't think I mean I saw like an ABC News alert this morning saying that someone had died with a pre-existing condition, and yeah, it's just a bit disappointing from that perspective.
Yeah, totally. What about you, Julia?
I've forgotten the question. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I
this
got
is fair enough.
on my neck hurting.
No, that's more than okay. So my question was, what was my question? Oh my God. Okay, my question was around, do you feel like the expertise of disabled and chronically ill people is being taken on board by the wider community in the context of the pandemic?
Yeah. I don't know. I feel like I'm really, like, I've got such an insular kind of group of people that I talk to and that I engage with. And like one thing that I've put up a lot of boundaries for myself when it comes to, because like I'm so online at the moment because I can't see anybody in person, and so I'm just like being exposed to way more crap than I'm used to, like just people's opinions that I don't particularly care about or want to hear, especially around things like, the vaccine and COVID being a hoax and all of this crap that I'm just like, I don't have the energy to fight it and I don't particularly want to engage with it. And so, yeah, in terms of like the wider world, paying attention to disabled people and like trying to engage with us and figure out what we know and how we can like pass on what we've learnt from our experiences that mirror a lot of what like able-bodied people and pre-disabled people and just other people are experiencing during this pandemic. Yeah, I don't know. Like my gut feeling is no. I don't feel particularly listened to, and I haven't really seen or heard other people in my community being listened to in a way that's really meaningful. Like there's the occasional kind of not the word, like consultancy kind of process where an organization has suddenly become aware of disability and like the importance of accessibility and whatever, and so they reach out to disabled groups and they're like, hey, do you have a member of your collective that we could talk to about this thing? We're not going to pay you, it'll be like 44 hours of your time, but we're really interested in hearing what you have to say. And yeah, I think there's definitely been an increase in that kind of engagement. That's me being really pessimistic. I know that there are like people who are actually genuinely trying to engage with us, but for the most part, it feels like I don't feel as though there's been a massive shift in the way that people listen to us, and a lot of the shift that I have seen has been a little bit like tokenistic and a little bit empty. Yeah, but what has your experience been, Caitlin?
Probably similar, I think. I think that there's been a bittersweetness to a lot of the changes. Oscar, do you want to come and play tug of war with the dog so I don't have to, just because I'm recording? So I think that there's been a kind of relief. Thank you. There's been a kind of relief that suddenly, for example, I'm finding a lot of communities and events to be a lot more accessible to me. But there's frustration in that because it took a pandemic for those things to be put in place. And I think that is a really good indication that sick and disabled people have not been listened to because it hasn't happened until it's been affecting people who are non-disabled. So yeah, I think that I hope that some of the incidental almost things that have taken place in the context of the pandemic have shown people what is possible in terms of access but I don't necessarily feel like that is because in a mainstream way, disabled people's expertise is suddenly being taken seriously. I think it's more kind of that incidental thing of like, oh, if we do let people work from home, they are still productive. And so I can see that it's not going to hurt my bottom line. So maybe that's okay, rather than being like, oh, you know, access is important. That's perhaps cynical. But it's also this kind of like interesting position where, while still wanting to fight for better platforms for our voices and for our perspectives, it's also like a little bit, I'll take what I can get to survive as well. So I feel like, you know, there might be some positives come out of the pandemic, but we still have a long way to go in terms of sick and disabled voices being prioritized. And then, of course, like the term or the category of sick and disabled people is a very, very broad category and encompasses so many different experiences and identities and all of that kind of a thing. So yeah, I think there's a long way to go before we are acknowledging that in a widespread way. I guess this sort of leads on to a more maybe practical question about what would you guys like to see happen in terms of, especially within political spaces. Are there particular barriers that you have come across in your political activism? And how do you think we can sort of reconceptualize activism to be more inclusive, for want of a better term?
I think, I mean, in terms of like things, I want things not to necessarily just revert back suddenly when things reopen. And I think I do have a lot of anxiety around that. I mean, we've kind of established that working from home is okay, you know, and you know, all these other like all these adaptations to the pandemic are like fine, they're completely implementable. But I feel like there's such a thirst for things to go back to normal, which for me means to be more exclusionary. I think as well, like obviously it's good it's good if the pandemic ends. That would be great. And I think as well, moving to online doesn't actually take everyone, particularly not the entire disabled community, to an accessible place. There's a lot of people who don't have great internet connections or for whatever reasons can't use the internet. So that's not been a perfect solution either. So yeah, I think having more options about how we're going to meet with people and talk to people and do our work or do our activism, I think like I hope that happens. Yeah, I don't feel that optimistic. I think for other like kind of movements, I think just a greater inclusion and intersectionality would be really good. I mean, one of the issues that we've kind of had with, say, like in the environmentalism space is that they're not really practically considering disabled people's needs in that. So things like the straw ban, which excludes like tons of people who do actually need plastic straws to drink and to like survive, has been it's really exclusionary, and especially since like a lot of us do really care about environmentalism and do want to do things to help the environment, but then there's sort of it's just exclusionary from the face of it and not really, I don't think, engaging with like the real like actors in like real polluters and that kind of thing. So and there's lots of other examples I think of like those sorts of things happening within like different activist spaces. So yeah, I think just greater inclusion from the get-go is really what's needed.
Yeah, absolutely. What about you, Julia?
Yeah, I agree. I think I think engaging people in conversation, like knowing that everybody, disabled or not, has different needs and different things that make them feel comfortable and make spaces accessible, and make movements accessible in the long term. I think it's important that we embed these kinds of conversations into our organising and into our movement building as a general rule, whether, because like you don't know whether somebody that you're engaging with in this kind of capacity is disabled or not. And it shouldn't be a matter of asking or having to find out later and then being like, oh shit, I should have asked. I don't know if I'm allowed to swear. Damn. I should have asked their access needs and I didn't. Oh no. Like, it should just be something that you do. And it makes sense that it's not at the moment, because ableism is really rampant and able-bodied supremacy is such a big thing. But I think that it's not unrealistic to add this into the way that we engage with each other in these kinds of spaces. I don't think it would require that much energy. I think it would be, and the benefits would massively outweigh any kind of added time it would take to implement. And I guess with that, I think about, I've been writing an article recently for Archer magazine, and in it I've been trying to reread a lot of the blog posts and articles and seminal texts that informed my understanding of disability justice and of disability justice and I guess related concepts and movements. And I was reminded of the term access intimacy, which I think is a really beautiful way of thinking about the way that I would like to engage with other people and I would like to relate to other people in these spaces, which is this feeling of just, it's so hard to put into words because it's a feeling like love, where it's you can try to put it into words, but really you know it when you feel it. And for me, it's the feeling that somebody else understands my access needs and I don't have to continuously communicate them. And I know that they have really listened to me. And if they need to know, if they need more information, if they have follow-up questions, they ask those, but I don't have to keep rehashing the same stuff. And so I might show up somewhere and get offered a chair immediately. I've had experiences where I go to parties and a friend of mine is there with me and they'll just immediately go find a chair for me because they know that I need one to have to be there. And I don't have to ask anymore. They're just I'll go get you a chair and a glass of water. I'll suss it out. And that to me is, just a really beautiful feeling of care and love that I think that I would like to see more of in these spaces. This really special feeling of being seen, and having your disability seen, and with that your access needs seen by the people that you're in community with, and not feeling like your disability is something that you have to leave at home when you go out, or something that you have to compartmentalize. It's an inherent part of who you are, and having somebody else recognize that, or having multiple people recognize that, I think is essential for disabled people to be involved in organising, and ultimately it will benefit other people as well who also have access needs that might not get accommodated otherwise.
It's also, to my thinking, it goes beyond being beneficial. Like when you talk about the benefit of that effort outweighing the effort and the time and the energy that goes into it, I think it goes beyond the benefit for individual disabled people as well. I think that movements in general, whether or not, and as you say, you don't always know, but whether or not they have any given collective has sick or disabled people as members at that point in time, approaching activist work with the principles of like slow relationship work, prioritizing this kind of deep care and this access intimacy and this like deep knowledge of people's needs, and the fact that people's needs are different, is going to be hugely beneficial to any political movement in terms of its like the sustenance of the movement itself, but also just the impact that it's able to have if we're putting the work into the building those relationships of care and prioritizing need. You know, that seems to me that it would benefit everybody, including the movement itself and the causes itself. Something I think a lot about is, and I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on this, but a big example that I've been thinking a lot about recently is the overlap between disability justice principles and transformative justice principles, which is a big part of abolition framework. And I think it's so interesting how much those two things overlap in terms of prioritizing care and accountability for harm and all of that kind of a thing. And in abolition in particular, to go on with that example, we often think, I think of, I'm speaking specifically of like abolition of the prison industrial complex, including policing and surveillance. And we talk about abolishing those systems, but in order to abolish them and still care for communities, we need to create and imagine different ways of being and different ways of responding to harm. And I think that sick and disabled people are experts in that area. And so I think that, you know, everyone can very much benefit from listening to that wisdom. I think that Leah Lakshmi Piepzna Samarasinha calls it crypt science, which I really love. Like, we have this, you know, crypt skills and crypt science that is this wealth of information over generations of communities and chosen families of care that can absolutely be then used in political activism. I haven't asked a question. But have I said anything that either of you would like to speak to? Erin, have you got anything to add? Or like, have you seen...
Oh, I
was going to try and formulate a sentence with a question mark at the end of it. Have you seen areas of activism or causes that you're involved with or passionate about that sort of overlap with disability justice in those ways?
Not really. I mean, I guess the sorts of spaces I've been in is sort of like a mad pride kind of spaces and like feminist spaces. And I think so mad pride is basically like disability activism. It's sort of not that different, really. It's just a more specialized. But I find that like feminist spaces, that at least the ones that I've been in, are more like, I've always been focused on specific outcomes rather than on like building like a community where people relate to each other in a certain way. It's more like, oh, we want this thing to not be there, or we want this thing. So no, I think my feeling is that like one of the things that I kind of like about disability activism is that it is so like community driven and needs driven, and like, of course, like there's certain outcomes that we want to fight for, but it's more of like a vibe, or like a set of attitudes, or, you know, like sharing. I think that I think makes it pretty unique. Yeah.
I'm really interested in this concept of the vibe as well, and how it, because it is, I think, disability justice is very community driven and relationship driven, but it's also, I think, really concrete in terms of its and I think those things can be very related to one another. I'm thinking in particular of like Mia Mingus's concept of pod mapping, and this kind of, again, I would say that this links to abolition in terms of its building kind of a structured network of care. But the idea is that you think of like, if I as an individual either needed support or needed to be held accountable, who are the people that I would go to? And if I don't have enough people, how do I go about actively, like proactively creating those relationships? So I think what excites me about disability justice is that relationship between like community building and relationship building, but the fact that it is quite, it takes those things and makes them practical, and it makes them a really viable way of being political and building and imagining political alternatives to things like the prison system or the carceral system or capitalism. Again, a rant without a question at the end. Let me.
I think I think part of what connects those two movements for me, or those two frameworks, is this idea that nobody is disposable. And I think that's what distinguishes disability justice in a nutshell from like disability rights work, is this idea that disability rights and the disability rights movement left out a lot of people, and it was really focused on white disabled people and straight disabled people and cisgender disabled people, and really viewed disability without like, or at least mainstream disability rights work. I'm sure there were subsets that were doing more intersectional work, but for the most part, it was kind of understood as disability being a single issue, a single identity issue. And that obviously left a lot of people behind. And disability justice, in contrast, is focused, I mean, one of the principles is leadership of the most impacted, and as well as intersectionality, and it always is trying to bring the focus back to disabled people who exist at the intersections of other forms of oppression, particularly disabled people of colour, Black disabled people, in Australia, definitely Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander first disabled people. And I think similarly, transformative justice work is, we see so often that when we're trying to, when we're responding to abuse and violence in communities, the people who often experience the most alienation and are the most at risk of that then leading to incarceration, if somebody is choosing to pursue legal action, the people the most at risk in those situations are going to be Black and brown people, queer people, trans women, like so frequently get so, like their treatment is so much worse than other people who cause the same harm. And yeah, I think transformative justice work really holds space for the way that those experiences need to be considered when we're doing this kind of, sorry for indigestion, when we're doing this kind of work, and making sure that we aren't disposing of people in our communities, and recognizing the conditions that lead to these things being able to happen, or these things being more likely to happen. So yeah, the idea of disposability, I think, is what connects them in my mind, at least.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes heaps of sense. Another thing I've been thinking a lot about recently, and I think it links to this idea of this kind of no one left behind and no one is disposable idea, is when I was reading Leah's book, I will no doubt talk about this a lot if we have the time to. So I'm going to show what it looks like. But it's called Care Work Dreaming Disability Justice. And it's amazing. But one of the bits that particularly blew my mind about this book was when Leah starts to talk about, like, you know, she's talking a lot about community, the importance of relationship building, the importance of chosen family. But then she makes this point that, like, focusing on that without being careful about certain things can exclude people who, for whatever reason, she says, like, aren't that likable, or like don't find socializing that easy, or prefer to live a quiet, isolated life? And I don't have any good answers to this, but as someone who finds it does not come naturally to me to build community around myself, I have to really, really work at it and prioritize it. I was just wondering if either of you have any thoughts on that kind of complicated area of disability justice, because I think that, especially in terms of initiatives which I think are so important, such as mutual aid, it does depend on networks and community building. So I was wondering if either of you have any thoughts around that.
I think I remember reading Care Work, and like it was very like inspiring and like open, like eye-opening and such. But I do remember feeling like, oh, I'm not really in any of these communities. I've never really participated in mutual aid in any kind of way that she describes. And I think that it's really hard. It's really tricky, I think, to build community, especially in the physical world, like not online. And like also like as someone who has moved around a lot and that kind of thing, it's really tricky. I don't know if like it kind of feels like it should be needs driven as well. Like I feel like what I need a community for is like to relate to and for support, like emotionally, but like my physical needs are more or less taken care of. And although I'm really interested in ensuring that everyone has their physical needs taken care of, it's just not like a huge priority for my day-to-day. And so I think that probably does undermine community a bit. But also, like, I have no idea where to find these communities. Yeah.
Yeah, I've felt similarly, especially not being in I used to live in Naarm, but now I'm on Jarrah country, which is central Victoria, and the access is very different to community building in regional places as well. What about you, Julia? Do you have any thoughts on?
I would say being a part of the formation of the Disability Justice Network, I feel like I'm in the closest thing that I've ever been to that kind of community. And because it's in its really early stages, it's hard to say what that necessarily looks like. But so far it has aligned itself pretty closely with a lot of the experiences that I've read about from Leah, from Mia Mingus, from Alice Wong. But I do think it's important to, like, as you've both touched on, like, there are so many disabled people who don't have internet access and who just aren't very online people, and that is going to make their access to these communities look much different to mine or to people that I'm friends with. And yeah, Caitlin, what you were saying about likability, and I think as well, it's important to think about how things like neurodiversity impacts how people are able to engage with these kinds of communities and the kinds of ways that we're welcoming people whose for whom socializing might look really different and whose communication styles might be really different, and the kinds of expectations we're putting on people to engage in a way that isn't necessarily accessible for this group of people. I guess what I'm thinking of is like people who are autistic, people who have ADHD, but also people who have intellectual disability or who are neurodivergent in other ways, who have psychotic disorders. Like I've seen, there are people that I know who have psychotic disorders who find it really hard to engage in community work, even with other disabled people, because it's it's still so stigmatized and people don't understand it, and communication looks really different for them, and it isn't necessarily people have had practice with. And so, yeah, I think in our disability work, we need to always be thinking about, we need to always be practicing cross-disability solidarity as well, and not just because like most of my disabled friends are like have mental illness but don't necessarily have specific mental illnesses, and are physically disabled but aren't necessarily like deaf or blind or deaf-blind. And so, yeah, thinking about how my work and the work that my friends are doing is inclusive of those people as well, because I think a lot of the time it's not.
It's really tricky. And I think that that is where the work of building alternative structures to the ones that we have now and aren't working, and alternative systems is really important, because I think that relationship-based work is so important, and it's absolutely itself a type of activism. But this is why I love Mia Mingus's idea of like pod building in that it's a structure. But it is complicated because the onus is on people's sociability and social skills. And so I think that part of the work maybe is thinking about how do we build structures and systems that are not capitalist structures, that are not ableist structures, that are not like white structures, but that will support everybody regardless of their ability to kind of advocate for themselves or to build communities around them in a social based way. It's a really big challenge, I think, and maybe one that we don't have the answers for yet. I was wondering if either of you have any questions that you would like to ask each other or the group, or any topics that you'd like to cover before we have to wrap up. Also, I've just noticed that Mike has popped in the chat. This was 10 minutes ago, so apologies, Mike. Can you describe the vibe, Erin, or anyone else? Like when earlier you were talking about the vibe of kind of disability justice work.
Yeah, I think it's not that it's a conflict-free space, or that people don't act like maybe not with goodwill, like sometimes. But I think in general there is a vibe, I guess, of radical acceptance. I think you can say like, I have trouble with this, and the response is, oh, okay, and to make that adaptation. And I feel like it's a mode of relating that is just like, cool, we'll facilitate that, like it's fine. And I do find that tends to be lacking, like in other spaces that I've been in. Yeah. But I'd be keen to know what other people think about the vibe, because I hate using the word vibe because it's so vague.
Julia, do you have thoughts on the vibe?
I'm keen to hear your thoughts. I feel like I've talked a lot.
I have really enjoyed you talking. Yeah, I really like that description, Erin, of it being like cool, as in like it's not a big deal. I also really think that there's a better appreciation in disability justice spaces of the social model of disability as opposed to the medical one, where we put a lot more faith in people's knowledge of their own experiences and their own bodies. And so there's perhaps more questions around, well, what do you need? And how can I make this space accessible to you, rather than like, oh, what have you got? Like, what could you please like list your DSM kind of diagnoses, or like tell us what your doctors think or whatever. And I'm not saying that there's not a place for those kinds of treatments and plans and engagement with the medical system, but I think that in the activist space, something I really appreciate is just believing people when they say that they need something, which I feel is, I wish, or I hope that that becomes more and more widespread as we have more and more of these kinds of conversations.
I don't know, like I don't know if either of you have read Mia Mingus talking about access intimacy before, but she does on the blog. I'd be really curious to know if you did want to read about it, if you haven't already, or if you have, I'd be keen to hear your thoughts on whether that concept and the way that she describes it speaks to the vibe, because when I hear you two talking about this, like this feeling of ease and comfort and being seen, and like even though there's conflict, and it doesn't like it's not necessarily all easy, it's it's just this this feeling of being seen and being heard and being listened to, and people honoring the fact that you are the expert in your own life and things like that. Like that really speaks to access intimacy as a concept to me, the way that I understand it. So I
have not read it, but I will be going there immediately after this talk wraps up. I think it sounds amazing.
Yeah, I've just written it down, but I haven't read it, so
awesome.
I will. Yeah.
Thank you, Julia. I feel like we have 10 minutes left. Do we have 10? Do we go till 6? Because if we do have a wait for a thumbs up or thumbs down from Mike, but if we do have more time on that, I would really like to be able to. Thank you, Mike says we can if we want. Do you guys want? Or are you burnt out and need to wrap up? Or if you got okay. Because one thing I would like to talk about is inspiration and other people and maybe mentors that you've had or people's work that you really value in this space. So Erin, would you like to maybe talk about that?
I feel like just in terms of family and friends, like obviously there's people with disability and chronic illness like all around me, but I never really got like a sense of, there's something shared, like we have a shared lineage of people who've come before us, and or even that like there's that like this disability thing is something that we can relate to one another on, but rather it's like something to treat or like under the medical model type thing. So yeah, it's really something that I've found more in later life, and I think like the internet's been really helpful for me. So like actually Twitter, Facebook, like I know it's not like always great spaces, and I kind of, because of the way that drama, I guess, is prioritized by the algorithms, I'm not sure that it is necessarily like the best space to have really thoughtful conversations, but it has really helped. So there's that. I think one of the things I read kind of early on when I was more like looking into disability and like as a culture and as a like an identity was Joanna Hedver's sick woman theory, which I think is like, I had to read it like 3 or 4 times to really like fully like have it sink in, but it's just informed so much of my thinking around this, and it's like been really like satisfying, I think, or affirming to have been able to read that. So it's just given me a lot, I think. Yeah.
For people who aren't familiar with that theory, I know it's a big thing to ask to kind of summarize, but would you be able to talk a little bit to why that's been so important for you?
I think I remember the lines like talking about different conditions, and they write like they have come to me. So it's not like I have this, but like that this experience has arose for me, and it provides a basis for me to which to like respond to it and to rethink about life. And I think as well, it's the essays talking back to neoliberalism in particular, talking about the value of bodies just, by virtue of existing, rather than being like contributing to work, or like the capitalist like run of the hamster wheel type thing. That's been really helpful too. Yeah. But yeah,
Thank
it's
you,
such
Erin. That's awesome.
it's so hard to like say, like give a line about
it was a big ask. Thank you for taking it on. Julia, I know that your cat is singing in the background, but would you like to unmute and talk maybe a bit about people or thinkers or activists that have been big for you in this kind of space?
Yeah, totally. Johanna Hedberg as well. Just such an incredible writer. And yeah, that essay similarly was like eye-opening for me, and I think was maybe the first time I read somebody articulating this idea of taking care of yourself and taking care of others as being this anti-capitalistic act, which, yeah, blew my mind at the time. Mia Mingus, Alice Wong, incredible. I really I love Carly Findlay's activist work. I think it's like she is so clearly dedicated to making the world more accessible and more respectful of disabled people, and I think she does it in a way that's really accessible for other people, which I really appreciate, because I recognize that a lot of like disability justice theory work, with the exception of Leah Lakshmi Piepta Samarasinha, who I think writes really accessibly, a lot of it is like heavy with jargon and with like, yeah, political theory kind of language. And so I really appreciate the way that Carly kind of breaks it down and makes it more about everyday stuff. My friend Marley, who I organise with through Disability Justice Network, is just like a phenomenal writer and phenomenal organizer. Again, just so dedicated to she just makes the weirdest noises sometimes. Yeah, just so dedicated to the work and so caring, and like she wrote an essay that I think everyone should read if you want to learn more, called On Hospitals, that's published in Overland. That's just, yeah, amazing. Yeah, I'll stop there, but there are so many people doing incredible work at the moment, who are like activists and organizers, but also like artists and poets and writers, and yeah, there's so much out there.
Totally.
What about you, Kate?
Totally. Second everyone that you have both said. Yeah, I'm trying to think, because it's a huge field. I think a lot of the work that Sins Invalid do is really exciting. Also, yeah, big fan of Leah, and then a lot of people just in my life that aren't necessarily like, I think especially within this space and within this work, so many of the people that teach me the most about care and about like activism are just people in my life who are sick and who are disabled, and who have just taught me so much, in particular about what it is to build community and to genuinely support through mutual aid, especially. Yeah. Mike is saying that we will have to wrap up in a minute. Do either of you have any kind of like closing statements that you would like to make?
I think I'm
You don't
good.
have to.
Yeah, I feel like we've covered so much ground. Like I feel like it's been a really like great conversation. So.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I really like, one thing that I am taking away from this is that maybe there is opportunity to build some kind of way for disabled people in across Australia to come together and be in community with each other, that isn't necessarily about organising and that isn't necessarily about movement building, but is more that relational work and being held by each other and practicing access intimacy with each other, because and like trying to manifest the communities that people like Leah talk about in their writing. I think that's something that I'm gonna think a lot about over the next few days and see if there's something there.
Yeah, me too. And I think often, political work comes out incidentally of those spaces as well, which is something really exciting.
Absolutely.
Yeah, maybe we should all be in touch about that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much to both of you. It's been very special.
Thank you for your chairing, Caitlin. It was awesome.
Yeah.
Very welcome. Thank you for allowing me to chair. I will be in touch with you guys. Thank you, everyone, for listening as well. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you to the festival for having us.